Hello and welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast. I hope you all, dear listeners, had a wonderful Christmas and a very good start to 2026. In this, the first episode of the year, I'm pleased to be welcoming Craig Lightoller onto the podcast for the first time. Craig is a historical reenactor and a playwright. He is here today to speak about his upcoming play, The Falcon's Last Flight, which Craig both wrote and will star in as King Henry VIII. This play dares to ask the question, what would a conversation between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn on the eve of Anne's execution looked like? Playing Anne Boleyn opposite Craig is Karen L Davies, who has herself been on the podcast to discuss her own highly compelling theories around Anne Boleyn portraiture. In this chat, Craig explains the basis for the play, what viewers can expect to see, and how it strips away King and Queen, refocusing them as two human beings whose legendary relationship entirely altered the course of history. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 119, The Falcon's Last Flight, with Craig Lightoller. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast. Craig Lightoller, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Adam. How are you? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. I'm very well, thanks. This is the first episode of 2026. You're the first guest of the year, which is always exciting. And you're here to talk about a play that you've written it, right? You actually wrote this play, is that correct?
I wrote the play, yes. It's the second play that I've written. The first was a monologue on Henry VIII, and I really wanted to tackle this next subject. So that was the drive.
I see, which we will come to in due course, which is The Falcon's Last Flight. That's what you're here to talk about today. Before we get into that discussion, though, a few questions to get to know you a bit better, because this is your first time on the podcast. So can you provide me with a bit of an introduction into your background? So where you grew up and what you now do full time?
Yes, of course. I grew up in Leicester, and now my work is I'm a student nurse. So I'm taking a nursing degree at the moment, which is coming to an end in August this year. And Tudor history seems to be the second passion. So I can't seem to merge the two together, though.
What first sparked your passion for Tudor history? Do you have something growing up that you can vividly recall?
Yeah, when I was younger, I spent a lot of time in Leicestershire. There's a big park called Bradgate Park and houses the ruins of the Grey family house. So Lady Jane Grey grew up there. So I was always around Tudor history. We used to go to Bradgate Park most weekends. And that was, I suppose, what started the Tudor history bug. Then I started reading backwards, actually. I started with Elizabeth and then went back, and Henry was the last one that I read. And so that's how I became interested.
And do you reenact as Henry quite a lot? Is that part of what you do?
Yeah, I'm part of the Tudor Players, which are a reenactment group. We don't do many occasions during the year. We like to keep them few and far between so that it doesn't take too much time, basically, so that when you do commit to one that you really do enjoy it. It's not a case of for the next 6 weeks we're on the road or in a different location and it becomes a chore. So we really do enjoy it. We keep to about 8 occasions every year. So that's how I got into reenacting, basically.
And with that in mind, if you had the ability to jump in a time travel machine and you can witness a single moment from history, what would you choose to go back to?
Well, this is a lot more recent, actually. I would love to have had afternoon tea with Marlene Dietrich at the Adlon Hotel at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. That's what I would like to do.
I mean, she's an iconic figure, obviously.
Absolutely, absolutely. I really like her story. I like the way that she turned her back on Hitler, basically, because she didn't agree with what he was doing.
Yeah, didn't she say something along the lines of Hitler has no understanding of what it is to be German? There was some.
Exactly, and basically became almost Americanized, which would have infuriated Hitler so much. So to actually get into the mind of this woman would be superb. I would love that opportunity.
But jumping back into the world of the Tudors, as I said at the start, you're here to talk about the play that you've written and that you're starring in as King Henry VIII, which is The Falcon's Last Flight. So introduce the play for me. What is the premise, and when and where will people be able to actually see it?
Okay. So, The Falcon's Last Flight is a powerful new Tudor era drama that almost dares to imagine the forbidden final night between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. It's like a story I've dubbed that history never recognizes or recorded. And it's set in the shadow chambers of the Tower of London on the eve of Anne's execution, and the play unfolds over a sleepless, candlelit night. And as Anne's awaiting her condemned fate in the morning, Henry arrives unannounced, and an exchange of wills starts. And I like to think that theatre gives the opportunity of people to think outside of the box. We know that this didn't happen, but what if it did happen? That's what I wanted to explore. What would be the consequences of them getting together that night? Would Anne have actually turned the king's opinion like Catherine Parr did? That's what I kind of thought about when I was writing it, and it's been put on at the Tramshed Theatre in Woolwich, which is a lovely intimate venue, and I think it's quite befitting because it's quite a personal story. I wanted to bring the audience as near to the action as possible, so they actually do feel the tension between. We won't be using microphones, so that shows you how intimate this place is. And I think that would really, I think microphones would kill the atmosphere completely. It's a very, very intimate look into not the lives of a king and a queen, but a man and a woman and a marriage, basically. That's the premise of where I wanted it to go.
Yeah, and a love story that is undoubtedly one of the most infamous and influential in history. And I think we often overlook this sounds a bit silly, but I think we often overlook the fact that Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn actually did exist and were humans. We're so conditioned to focus on them as figures of the past that we can sometimes overlook the human condition that undoubtedly played their life just as much as it does today, which is why I think these sorts of conversations are actually really interesting, even though we know that this didn't actually happen. You're playing Henry VIII opposite Karen L Davies, who's been on my podcast as well, actually. She's playing Anne Boleyn. I didn't know she did this sort of thing. So did she work alongside you, or did you reach out to her to invite her in to play Anne?
No, I wrote The Falcon's Last Flight purely by myself. It was just a topic that I had in mind that I wanted to address and explore myself. But I met Karen quite recently. She's just released her first book called The Traitor's Gift. And she asked me if I'd go along to Allington Castle and portray Henry just for photographs, and there'd be somebody dressed as Anne Boleyn, which was her niece. And that's how I got to know Karen, and her knowledge for Anne Boleyn really inspired me. And I thought, if there's somebody I need to capture the essence of what I need to come out of this script, it's going to be Karen. She has this ability to be able to think like Anne Boleyn, which was interesting when we went and did the photo shoot for the programs recently in Peterborough. She switched from being Karen to being Anne Boleyn, and there was a definite switch. And I thought, I picked the right person. And she also said to me that I was very easy to work with, and I put her at ease enough to not feel self-confident about letting herself go into full character. So I think we've made quite a powerful connection there.
Lovely. She was on my podcast talking about Anne Boleyn's portraiture, and in particular her theories around the Holbein sketches, and I am in complete agreement with much of what Karen says.
I think she's putting quite a strong point forward here with this portraiture, and I really do wish her well with what she's done.
Well, she mentioned to me a couple of weeks ago that it's just growing and growing and has been picked up by. She didn't tell me much because I'm assuming a lot of it's embargoed, but that it's now gone to quite high levels, and the research is growing ever more compelling. And the Holbein sketch that many believe is Anne, I've always believed is firmly not, which is absolutely Karen's opinion. So I'm always thrilled when when new evidence.
When somebody backs your theory.
Exactly, because I'm right, obviously. What was the inspiration behind this play? I can't help, and I hope you won't be offended, but briefly think of that amazing, emotionally charged scene in Anne of a Thousand Days where Henry VIII visits Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn rips him a second arsehole, and it's wonderful. Was that part of it going on?
It's a very perceptive connection that you've made, and you're right to feel that echo. The inspiration behind the Falcon's last flight briefly, and I would say deliberately, brushes against the emotional charged prison scene of Anne and a Thousand Days. But the Falcon's flight was born, I think, from a more deeper, more unsettling question of what if that visit was not an act of mercy or farewell, but a reckoning neither of them could escape. Where Anne of a Thousand Days gives us a Henry already retreating behind inevitability, I'll get my teeth in. The Falcon's last flight imagines something more dangerous and a little bit more human. It allows us to experience the psychological vacuum on the night before history closed the jaws on the Boleyns. So this play is driven by the silence of the historical record on Anne's final night, coupled with the emotional truth that unfinished relationships do not end cleanly, and suggests the idea that Henry may have needed that meeting as much as Anne did. The other thing that was really important to me was to give Anne a voice, and displays Anne's fierce insistence that her death would not be the end of her story, nor her daughter's. So that was really important for me to bring forward in the writing. So while the film scene, I think, was a great spark in my initiation and thinking, how can I make this bigger? How can I put more into this? The Falcon's Last Fight, I think, is a bit more confrontational. It's a lot more intimate. It strips away courtly distance and places two people. So we're taking them from being the king and the queen, and we're putting them into a locked room with nothing left to protect them but their words.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing is that scene in Anne of a Thousand Days, it's very much a dressing down of Henry VIII, isn't it? It's Anne getting one over on him and knowing that would infuriate him. Whereas, I mean, obviously I haven't seen the play yet, I will be, but from what I know, this is more of a conversation. It's more of an examination of where did this go wrong? What were the moments in our relationship? And it is and as I understand it, it's a total two-parter. There's no other courtiers or figures on stage. Is that correct?
That's right. And that was entirely deliberate and really central to what I wanted to achieve for the play. Because I thought by stripping it back to just two voices, it removes familiar tudor distractions. So no courtiers, no Cromwell, no politics spoken through others, and no spectacles to soften the blows. So what remains is the relationship itself, and it's totally exposed and unavoidable. It also allowed me to direct the viewer's attention to making the characters three-dimensional, which I think sometimes is lost in documentaries and literature, that we just see a one-dimensional view of these characters, often playing Henry VIII. I'm questioned. I don't think Henry would have apologized for anything. And I have to question why that would be asked, because he was a very highly intelligent man. And I can't believe that when he was sat on his own, that he wouldn't have had to replay what he'd done and sort of come to terms with it himself. So that was really why I wanted to keep it as a two-hander, so that it brought these two characters to life, and there is no other distractions of going around it. So you're actually listening to the dialogue that is between these two people. And I think history usually crowds their marriage with advisors, accusations, rumors, trials. And I wanted to ask a more intimate question of what happens when there's no court left to perform for. That is where I wanted to take the Falcon's last flight, because there is no escape. Neither character can hide behind power, rank, or protocol. And there's no dilution of responsibility, meaning that every choice, betrayal, moment of tenderness must be owned, and it also gives Anne emotional parity, not as a victim, but as an equal participant in the reckoning.
And it's so true. I think that we tend to categorise Henry VIII as a sort of a villain with very little grasp of emotion. But I think he would have been, in his own way, probably would have also mourned Anne a little bit. I have always stood by the fact that I think she was the love of his life.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I've described them so many times on this podcast, but I've often felt them as a bit like the Tudor Burton and Taylor.
Yeah.
Can't live with, can't live without.
Yes.
Where the relationship is so intense that it's only ever going to implode. But that doesn't mean the love wasn't real.
Totally agree with you. And I'm so happy to hear somebody else say that. Really.
Well, the argument it's Jane is just nonsense. I mean, she just didn't disappoint him. Catherine, I think, was his teenage crush, his first love. But as far as the love of his life, it's Anne.
The love was Anne. Look what he did to actually get the ring onto Anne's finger. He turned the country upside down.
And actually, the way it ends, a good friend of mine is Dr. Estelle Perronc, who is of the opinion that Henry VIII was incapable of love. And she's like, how could he execute a woman he loved? And I'm like, part of me goes, well, actually, it kind of makes sense in the context of them. The passion was so intense that it was, as I say, it was only ever going to explode. And for that reason, if we look at the carefully staged, managed process of her execution down to the sword, there's aspects of it that he doesn't give to Catherine Howard a few years later.
Exactly.
And it's just so interesting when you think about it in that context.
Yes, I agree. Totally agree with you.
So talk to me about the Henry VIII that you've created. As I understand it, he visits Anne not as king, but he goes there as a man. So what's going on there? What is he looking to get out of this, I suppose? What's he looking to achieve? Okay.
Well, as I've said previously, I always like to try and do a psychological profile of the people that I'm portraying so that I can give a much more rounded performance. And so I've stripped Henry so that he's not the monarch in the portraits and the proclamations. He arrives without court and the crown or an audience, because this visit's about authority. It's about unfinished business between two people who once believed that they were destined to be together. This Henry steps into the tower not to command, but because I feel kingship has failed him to a certain extent. And when Henry visits Anne, he's no longer seeking obedience or validation. He's seeking absolution, clarity, control over the story that will outlive him. History will remember him as a king, and this work asks whether in that moment he's terrified of being remembered as something else entirely. And I've tried to create the emotions inside him, which are deeply human and sometimes a little bit uncomfortable for me playing Henry, but also for anybody watching from the outside. Because I thought three thoughts came to my mind when I was creating Henry. The first was the collapse of the great love that once justified everything that he did. The second was the knowledge that the power that did not protect him from regret. And the third was the fear that Anne, even in death, may still define him. So then I went on from that and I thought, well, actually, there's a fourth on top of this. And that could he separate his guilt from his responsibility? So these were all parts of Henry that I wanted to explore and bring to the play. So he hasn't come to save her, but to understand himself, I think. And he wants to hear Anne's voice one last time because it's the only one that ever truly challenged him. Courtiers obeyed, wives endured, but Anne answered back. And he tells himself that the crown demands this outcome, that England requires this sacrifice, that history will understand. But beneath that rhetoric is a far more straightforward truth. A king can rule in certainty, but a man cannot live with it. And that's what I wanted to bring forward. So the portrayal of Henry is neither a monster or redeemed. He's a man who discovers too late that authority cannot silence memory and that love, once weaponized, never truly disappears.
And that ultimately he's also entirely beyond control of what history will say of him once he dies, I suppose. And Anne is what makes Anne, I think, so fascinating when compared to the other queens is that Anne Boleyn, to me, has always felt more like a facet of his reign as much as one of his wives. And by that, what I mean is when we look at Henry VIII's reign, the Six Wives is the most instant response people think of. But more broadly, if we look at the aspects of his reign, the facets of his reign, you've got the Reformation, you've got the break from Rome, you've got the Pilgrimage of Grace, you've got Anne Boleyn. She is a facet as well, and therein makes her stand out, yes. I think. And it's... And I mean, I think Henry will be turning in his grave knowing how undoubtedly she is the most beloved, the most popular of the six, as we refer to them.
Very much so.
And that's always when I've occasionally been asked if I had the ability to jump in a time travel machine, it's not necessarily that, but I would love to go back and go, by the way, you do realise it's the man that determines the sex of a baby, just to see his face drop.
That's a really good point, actually.
I'd love that. Would just be so satisfying, just to see his little piggy eyes bug out.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think I'd be on a one-way street to the chopping block. So conversely of that, then introduce the version of Anne that you've created and that Karen is bringing to life. What do we see of her character?
Well, I wanted to write her as not a ghost in waiting, nor the tragic icon history reduces her to. She's very much alive in her final hours. She's intellectually fierce, emotionally lucid, and terrifyingly composed. They were the three main sort of facets that I wanted to bring of her. Anne understands exactly where she is and what awaits her, but she refuses to let the knight or Henry define her solely by death. Anne has made a quiet, radical decision. If she cannot control her fate, she will control her meaning. And she realises there's no bargaining and does not plead or seduce or soften herself to Henry. And the girl who once danced at court has gone, and in her place stands a woman who sees Henry quite clearly. His strengths, his cowardice, and his need to be understood. And so she speaks with precision, and her power lies in how little she needs from him. And I think that starts to chip at Henry. This is the first time I think that he sees Anne for the strength that she really was. Where Henry kind of circles around guilt and walks straight through it. She confronts love honestly, acknowledging that what they shared was real, but also naming how it was corrupted by ambition and fear. And she allows herself grief without letting it consume her. And so she uses this opportunity to be Henry's equal in thought and argument. And she challenges his justifications and refuses to let the crown serve as a shield from personal responsibility. So most crucially, Anne's focus is obviously on Elizabeth's future. Elizabeth is proof that Anne's life mattered beyond scandal and blood, and Anne understands that history is written by those who endure, and she intends to endure differently. In the end, what defines the Anne that I've written is not her death, but her refusal to disappear quietly into it.
And without giving too much away, can you walk me through the storyline, the core storyline? What do Henry and Anne discuss?
So the Falcon's last flight, I would say it unfolds as a single unbroken conversation. Intimate, volatile, relentlessly honest, between Henry and Anne on the night before her execution. The play doesn't move forward through plot twists, but through revelation. Each exchange peels back another layer of what they were, what they became, and what they cost one another. I think at its heart, they return to the beginning, not romantically, but truthfully. And there is an acknowledgement that what bound them was real and dangerous and transformative. And this isn't nostalgia, it's an attempt to understand how love became justification and how desire reshaped the kingdom. So Henry often speaks of duty, the crown, and inevitability. I can't get my teeth in today, Adam. Inevitability. But Anne refuses to let those words go unchallenged. I mean, much of the tension comes from Anne pressing Henry to separate necessity from choice. And Henry is always resisting that separation. This is where the play becomes most combative, but is also the most revealing. Their conversation moves into belief. It's not just religious faith, but faith in self, in destiny, in the idea that history will one day explain them. Anne questions whether belief excuses action. Henry questions whether doubt weakens the rule. Perhaps the most unsettling strand in their awareness of how they'll be remembered. Henry is deeply concerned with legacy and how this moment will read to future generations. And Anne, by contrast, is concerned with truth. Who gets to tell the story? Who is silenced? And whether silence itself can be a form of power. And so the play's structure allows the balance of that power to shift repeatedly at times. So Henry dominates at others, and then Anne comes in and controls the room entirely. So what begins a visit feigned by authority slowly becomes a reckoning shaped by honesty.
And I suppose, touching on what you said there about not necessarily being nostalgic, but there's always that moment, I think, in any relationship, particularly a relationship that's sexual, that's a personal relationship. When that breaks down, there's always that introspective moment where you do look back and you look at the good bits and go, well, how did that go from that to something else, and where did the love go? And I suppose this is an example of that turned up to 11 because of who these people were.
Yeah, very much. I mean, they're very much in the public eye. It was well known that their fights were extremely dangerous and public. So why wouldn't this be the same thing? I couldn't let Anne just be this simpering character, because I don't believe she was. I felt to believe that she was. And I feel that this was partly what Henry didn't like about her, actually, that he realized he couldn't control her. And therefore she became a threat to him. So that's basically what I'm going to reveal about the play so far. If you want to know more, you're going to have to come along.
But based on what you've said there, it sounds like that the play is also exploring two people who ended up having very different accounts of how and what their relationship looked like.
Very much so. I think what's revealed is a shared memory of the rise and the fall of both of them, but two sharply divergent narratives that can never be reconciled, even though they describe the same event. For Henry, the story of their ascent is famed as inevitable. He remembers momentum, a kingdom in motion, a marriage that had to happen, and his rise is political, almost abstract. And even in the fall of Anne, he says that it's something he cannot stop. He tries to deny any or take any responsibility for that. And so for Anne, their rise is personal, deliberate, and costly. She recalls the risks taken in private, the resistance she faced, the moments where ambition and belief were conscious acts rather than tides carrying her along. And where Henry sees destiny, Anne sees decision. And where he speaks of movement, she speaks of consequences. So this difference becomes most striking in how they interpret the fall. Henry tends to view the collapse of their union as a tragic malfunction, that something went wrong in an otherwise justified journey, whereas Anne sees it as the inevitable result of unequal power in which one person is always allowed to survive the story and the other is expendable within it. So while writing, I soon realised that they both agree on what happened, but they fundamentally disagree on why it happened, who controlled it, and who ultimately paid the price.
What would you say is the central theme of this play?
I think at its core, it explores what power costs when love is involved, and who's left to bear that cost when history moves on. The central theme is authorship. Who gets to shape the story of a life, a relationship, and a nation when events are over and voices are silenced? And through this secretive encounter that I've imagined between Henry and Anne, the play interrogates several deeply entwined ideas, one of them being power versus truth. Henry represents institutional power, the ability to act, decide, and survive consequences, and Anne represents moral and emotional truth, the lived reality of those decisions. So the play asks whether power can ever fully control the truth, or whether truth waits for power to pass. And both characters are actually aware that history is watching. The play asks whether legacy belongs to the powerful or those who speak last and speak truthfully, like a voice at the edge of silence. So ultimately, it's about what it means to be heard when time is almost gone, what remains when crowns are removed, titles fall away, and two people are left with nothing but memories, consequences, and the need to be understood.
And I know that, it's in the title, but the Falcon, Anne's badge, is symbolic of the emotional core of the play. So how so? How does that manifest?
Falcon is not just a visual motive, but I wanted it to be the emotional spine of the play. So the Falcon, as you said, is associated with the emblem of Anne Boleyn, but I see it as a sharp vision, elevation, and controlled power, which becomes a metaphor for Anne's inner life rather than a public image. I wanted the Falcon to represent Anne at her most truthful, not the flirt of court gossip nor the condemned queen of legend, but a woman who once rose by choice, intellect, and conviction. Falcons are not passive creatures. They are trained, constrained, and expected to perform, yet they retain instinct, sight, and lethal clarity. So on the night of the 18th of May, 1536, Anne understands that while her body will be taken, her spirit will still exist. So I decided to recognise that Anne's last flight is not about defeat, but about her release. And one of the play's quiet tensions is the contrast between symbols. The crown represents authority, continuity, and history written by the victor, whereas I wanted the Falcon to represent vision, agency, and history felt by the cost bearer. Henry wears the crown, and Anne becomes the Falcon. So Anne may lose her life, but the Falcon reminds us she does not lose her voice, her clarity, or her identity. Her final flight is inward and moral and indelible. It's the moment she escapes reduction to scandal, to victimhood, to silence. And so that's how I wanted the Falcon to be the creature that takes flight once she goes.
And what would you say is the central question the Falcon's Last Flight asks, and how does that impact the way that we, I suppose, choose to view Henry and Anne's story?
Ultimately, the way that we see Anne's story and Henry's story is quite tragic. And I wanted to bring in the sense that there was love there. And I wanted to revisit that. And it does revisit that in the play. It's not all about one person trying to get on top of another person with rhetorical throwbacks. That I wanted to bring in those bittersweet moments as well. And what I didn't realize when I first started writing The Falcon's Last Flight was actually what I was writing was a love story. It didn't come to me until actually I'd read through it about 4 or 5 times. And I thought, if there was no love there, then ultimately, why would Henry have bothered to have gone and seen her for one last time? That's what I wanted to bring through.
Well, my final question for you is that this play it's a total what if moment. We know that the meeting, we believe the meeting didn't take place. We can't ever be 100% sure, but it almost certainly didn't. But I think many of us Anne Boleyn devotees wish that Anne could have had that final exchange with Henry. I think it's one of the big reasons why people, myself very much included, so adore Geneviève Bujold in Anne of a Thousand Days. Based on your knowledge of the story and having spent time writing this play, do you think that had Anne Boleyn had this opportunity to meet with Henry the night before her execution, that history could have turned out very differently for her?
I love that you open the question with, we don't know whether this happened or not. Because that was the initial idea that I had. And it's what I'd like people to have in their minds. I don't want them coming in closed and blinkered that this didn't happen. I'd like them to go away and say, okay, I've just watched something that actually makes me question, this could have actually happened. And it's a really beautiful human question, and one that sits right at the emotional edge of The Falcon's Last Flight. But I think the honest answer the play leans to is no, history wouldn't have turned out any different for Anne. But how we understand their story might have changed. I mean, by the time of that imagined first exchange, Anne's fate was already sealed by forces far larger than emotion, succession anxiety, political expediency, and Henry's need for a male heir, the machinery of power he built. Even if Anne spoke truth in her heart and Henry would have listened with complete clarity, the structure of the moment leaves very little room for mercy. And the kings can't hesitate, systems rarely do. So while Anne's life may not have been saved, her voice might have been fully heard, and that's what matters here. A final exchange would not have undone the charges, the trial, or the sentence, but it could have stripped away Henry's most powerful defence, and that was distance. But to hear Anne plainly, without witnesses or intermediaries, would force Henry to confront not what he's done, but what it's cost and who has to pay that cost. And the tragedy of Anne Boleyn is not only that she died, but that history largely heard her through the voices of men who survived her. And The Falcon's Last Flight imagines a moment where that imbalance is briefly corrected, not by saving her, but allowing her agency and clarity and an authorship at the end to put her voice forward. So if Anne had that final exchange, history may not have spared her body, but it might have been less able to have simplified her. And for Anne Boleyn devotees, I think that is perhaps the most painful truth of all, that it wouldn't have saved her from the executioner, but I think she would have had a much more fairer reckoning.
Well, I, for one, am incredibly excited to see this play. When does it actually come out, and how long is it running for?
Right, we're premiering one night only, purely because my nursing studies have to take priority at the moment. But I like having many hands in many different pies, and I was itching to get this out into the public. So it has its premiere night on the 9th of May. And as I said, at the Tramshed Theatre in Woolwich. It's really easy to get to. You get off at the Woolwich Arsenal underground station, and the Tramshed Theatre is literally right next door. You can't get any closer. So that's the inaugural showing of the play. My agent is trying to get us to the Edinburgh Fringe in 2027 for the 5-week run, which will be quite interesting. And also we're trying to chip away at Chichester Arts Festival as well, and getting it shown down there, in the hope that it builds momentum and catches somebody's eye, and we can make this bigger.
Wonderful. Well, I will be attending. I'm really looking forward to it, because I think this is such a fascinating story, and I'm really looking forward to it. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast to discuss The Falcon's Last Flight with me.
You're very welcome. We've got our first read-through on Saturday with myself, Karen, and the director. And it's going to be interesting to actually hear those words with different voices and how they sound differently to how I've written them. I'm really, really excited to hear this.
Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast. Are you? Can people find more information about this across social media? Are you on social media?
My website is www.iamhenry.co.uk. Tickets can also be bought through that link as well for the show. There is a link on there. I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook as I Am Henry. I'm on TikTok as I Am Henry. And Instagram as I Am Henry. Let's keep it simple.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much again. And you and I will meet in the flesh when I come to see you in the play.
It will be a pleasure to meet you.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Craig for coming on to discuss the upcoming play, The Falcon's Last Flight, with me. Next week, I'm welcoming back onto the podcast Elizabeth Goth, who is here to speak about her book, Bloody Brilliant Tudors. That will drop next Thursday. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast guests or topics, feel free to drop me a message on Instagram, or if you're a subscriber, you can drop me a message on Patreon. Thank you again for being a listener to the Tudor Chess podcast, and chat to you next week.